The sun dipped low behind the ancient baobab trees, spilling honey-colored light over the village of Ndari, nestled deep within a sacred forest that had whispered the wisdom of ancestors for generations. Everything in Ndari pulsed with meaning, from the patterns etched into clay walls to the rhythm of drums echoing across the hills. This was not a village governed by clocks or borders, but by spirit and tradition. It was said that the forest listened, that the trees leaned slightly toward those who carried truth in their bones. And no one carried more truth than Amina. She was born during a lunar eclipse, with a cry so loud it split the night in half. As she grew, her voice became her gift and her curse. She spoke plainly, with a clarity that unsettled men accustomed to obedience. She questioned the way things had always been, why women were forbidden from the council fires, why the elders covered for the warriors who took what wasn't theirs, why the sacred grove was locked away behind chants and fear. Her voice was not shrill or angry, it was calm, melodic, too precise, too dangerous. She made people remember things they had tried to forget. Amina became both admired and feared. The villagers would gather to hear her speak when no elders were around, their hearts swelling with recognition, their eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. But eventually, someone always told. Someone always broke under the weight of fear disguised as tradition. One morning, as dew still clung to the grass and smoke from morning fires curled in the air, Amina stood before the gathering tree and accused the village council of protecting men who harmed the women of the lower huts. Her voice did not waver. Her words cracked something ancient and hidden. She was dragged away before she finished her sentence. The elders gathered that afternoon under the wide-leafed okan tree, where matters of silence were decided. They said her voice was possessed. They said she had stirred anger in the spirits. They said the ancestors would abandon the village if she continued. But most of all, they feared that others would begin to speak too. That night, under a dark moon, they performed the binding. Amina was brought to the center of the village, her wrists tied, her body trembling not with fear but fury. A cloth, indigo-dyed and etched with ancestral symbols, was wound tightly around her mouth. The cloth was sacred, they claimed. It would silence her spirit as well as her tongue. As they knotted it at the back of her head, a low wind swept through the village, rustling the trees though the air had been still moments before. Somewhere, a baby began to wail uncontrollably. A dog howled and then ran off into the night. The oldest elder's eyes widened, but he said nothing. A seer woman, bent with age and forgotten by most, watched from her hut and whispered, "When silence falls on the wrong voice, the ancestors will awaken." No one heard her over the crackling of firewood and the murmured prayers. But the forest did. That same night, Amina slipped away. Her feet bare, her face streaked with tears and ash, she moved through the shadows like a hunted deer. The villagers did not stop her. Some hoped the forest would swallow her. Others feared what might return in her place. Deeper and deeper she went, past the familiar trails, beyond the sacred markers, until even the animals grew silent. Some say the forest shifted as she entered, the trees bending slightly as if bowing. Others say the moon reappeared through the clouds for just a moment, casting a single beam of silver light that followed her path. But all agree on one thing: from that night on, the air around Ndari felt different. The boundary between the living and the dead grew thinner. And though Amina never spoke another word, something ancient had begun to stir. At the farthest edge of Ndari, where the huts gave way to thick-rooted trees and moss-covered stones, Amina lived alone in a dwelling made of woven branches and earth. Smoke never rose from her fire pit. She planted no crops. She spoke to no one. Yet somehow, she endured. Every morning, just before the sun touched the tops of the tallest trees, she could be seen walking barefoot along the forest's edge, her cloth-bound mouth facing east as though greeting something no one else could see. Her presence had become a kind of ghost within the village, a living silence, a question people were too afraid to ask. Children watched her from behind tree trunks, their wide eyes filled with fascination and confusion. They had heard the stories whispered by their mothers, that Amina had spoken against the elders, that she had been punished by the ancestors themselves, that the cloth around her mouth was the only thing keeping the village from falling into ruin. Yet these same children felt drawn to her, as if the silence she carried was not a curse but a secret waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes the bravest ones would creep closer, daring each other to toss pebbles or leaves near her path, only to scatter when she turned and looked at them, not with anger, but with an intensity that made their bones feel too small for their bodies. The older villagers, especially the elders, watched Amina with a very different gaze. Fear rippled through their glances. They remembered the fire in her words, the way her voice had made people listen, question, doubt. They saw how even in silence, her presence was not broken, it was amplified. She had not faded, as they'd hoped. She had transformed. Her silence made her seem less human, more spirit. Sometimes, the wind changed direction when she walked through it. Sometimes, the birds stopped singing until she passed. And sometimes, at twilight, people swore they saw shapes move behind her, mist-like figures at the edge of sight. "She is not cursed," muttered some of the old women under their breath when the council wasn't listening. "She is becoming something else." But the elders would not allow such thinking. "Do not stir the cursed girl," they warned, especially to the young. "She walks with things that should remain asleep. Her silence is not peace, it is bait." And so, Amina remained on the edge, caught in the stillness between fear and myth, a presence too heavy to ignore, too dangerous to confront. As the season of thick rains approached, the village prepared for the annual ritual of containment, a ceremonial act meant to keep the spirits of the dead at rest. It was one of Ndari's most sacred traditions. Fires would be lit at the four corners of the village, herbs burned, drums played through the night, and prayers recited to remind the dead that their time had passed. Spirit keepers, drawn from the lineages closest to the ancestors, would walk the village's perimeter to renew the protective veil. It was a ritual of safety, or control, depending on who you asked. Amina, descended directly from one of the founding spirit keepers, should have led the walk. Her great-grandmother had sung the veil into being decades ago. Her mother had died young, before passing the gift. Yet this year, as in every year since her silencing, Amina's name was left off the ritual list. The new spirit keepers were chosen from more obedient bloodlines, those who would not ask why, who would not look beyond the script. No one said her name aloud during the planning. But everyone felt her absence like a drumbeat just beneath the skin. Some villagers protested in quiet corners, suggesting that perhaps her connection to the old ways was too deep to ignore. That leaving her out was risky. That maybe the ancestors were waiting for her. But those voices were always hushed quickly. Still, the signs grew harder to deny. The forest had been restless. Birds flew in strange patterns. Deer no longer drank from the village stream. Dreams came heavier, full of fire, whispering voices, and ancient drums beating out of rhythm. One night, the sacred tree at the heart of the village dropped all its leaves at once, despite no wind and no season for shedding. "She watches us," someone whispered during a fireless night, eyes darting toward the trees. "She isn't watching," another replied. "Something else is watching through her." And yet, Amina did nothing. She lit no fire. She cast no spell. She simply existed, silent, strange, and ethereal, like the eye of a storm the village had tried to forget was coming. The days slipped past like mist drifting through trees, quiet and constant, but something had changed in the rhythm of the forest. Amina could feel it first in the wind, no longer a simple breeze moving leaves, but a living breath that brushed against her skin with purpose. It began softly, a tug of air that curled around her neck or pushed at her back like a guiding hand. Then came the gusts that arrived without warning, whispering her name in voices not quite human, not quite wind. She would freeze, listening, her hands trembling slightly at her sides as the syllables floated past her ears like forgotten prayers. Me, na. The trees, too, had begun to move differently. Their trunks did not just sway with weather, they leaned, shifted, watched. Branches that once merely reached toward the sky now seemed to stretch down as if beckoning her to step further in. Roots surfaced in looping patterns beneath her bare feet, rearranged overnight, forming circles or spirals that hadn't been there the evening before. When she walked now, the forest walked with her, the birds pausing mid-song, the air tightening around her like held breath. At twilight, the whispers came. Low, layered sounds that rose like fog from the undergrowth, too tangled to understand yet too deliberate to ignore. They spoke in the voices of women and men, old and young, voices cracked with time and others clear as mountain streams. They did not demand or threaten. They invited. They remembered. They watched. And Amina began to feel watched. It was a cold night when the first figure appeared. The moon was a sliver above, silvering the world in its quiet glow, and the air was thick with the scent of damp bark and fallen leaves. Amina sat beneath a wide-trunked tree, listening, when the silence around her sharpened like a blade. Her breath caught in her throat. From the corner of her vision, something glowed, not fire, not moonlight, but a soft internal light, like the last ember of a sacred flame. She turned slowly. Standing among the trees were figures, tall, robed in garments that shimmered with the patterns of stars and ash. Their faces were veiled in light, but their eyes were unmistakably human. They did not move closer, only watched. As her gaze met theirs, the cloth around her mouth pulsed, a strange warmth spreading from the knot behind her head. Then, as if aware of the moment, it tightened. Not with a tug of string or wind, but from within, like something alive, restraining her, warning her, silencing her more fiercely than ever. Her hands flew to the cloth, but it would not budge. Her chest tightened, her heart thudding as panic rose. The glowing figures remained still, their light flickering gently, not hostile but heavy with presence. Then, just as suddenly, they vanished, dissolving into the forest with a rustle of leaves and a hum that faded into silence. Amina sat in the dirt until dawn, her back against the tree, trembling and wide-eyed, the cloth still wrapped around her like a seal. The memories came after that night, not in dreams, but while awake. Sharp and sudden, like lightning cracking through her skull. She saw her younger self, maybe 8 or 9, standing barefoot in the rain, laughing as others hid indoors. She had heard the storm before it came, had told her mother hours in advance that the skies would cry. And they had. She remembered lying under the stars, watching them shift and blink, and telling her grandmother that the stars weren't just lights, they were eyes. She had once woken screaming, her dreams full of strangers' faces, weeping, singing, calling her name in tones she hadn't heard before and couldn't forget. Her grandmother, a quiet woman with clouded eyes and hands like worn leather, had whispered to her once, after a night of visions, "You are a bridge, child. 1 foot in the world, 1 in the beyond. Never forget, the veil can thin." But she had forgotten. Or rather, the village had taught her to forget. They had told her the voices were madness. That dreams were tricks. That knowing too much was dangerous. So she buried it, hardened herself, spoke her truth only in the language of justice, not spirit. Until even that was taken from her. Now the veil was thinning again. The signs were everywhere, the glowing figures, the whispering wind, the way the forest bent toward her as if listening to the silence wrapped around her face. She was not just silenced. She was being transformed, remade into something neither fully woman nor fully spirit. Amina could feel it. Her body was still flesh, still grounded by blood and heartbeat, but her essence was shifting. She felt it at the edge of sleep, in the way her breath echoed louder in her own ears, in the way her feet never bruised despite walking miles barefoot through root and stone. She didn't understand why it was happening, not fully. But she understood this, the ancestors had not abandoned her. They were waiting. And her silence, the thing meant to shame and erase her, had become a door. Something was coming through. And she, whether she wanted to be or not, was the threshold. It began with the drums. Not the kind made by human hands, not the ones carved from tree trunks and stretched with animal skin. These drums came from beneath the earth, from the roots, from the marrow of the forest itself. Amina first felt them as vibrations under her bare feet, a slow, steady pulse that traveled up her legs and settled into her chest like a second heartbeat. Each beat came with a memory, not entirely her own, fires in ancient circles, ash smeared across faces, dancers cloaked in light. The air around her shimmered as if the forest were exhaling. That night, she did not sleep. Instead, she walked deep into the sacred grove, past the twisted arch of trees that marked the place where only the spirit keepers were once allowed. The villagers called it the womb of the ancestors, and even the boldest men refused to hunt there. Legend said it was the place where the first breath of the first elder was taken. Amina stepped into the clearing slowly, the moonlight fractured across her skin, shadows dancing like curious hands. And then they came. One by one, shapes emerged from the trunks of trees and from the folds of moonlight. At first, they were just figures of light, hazy, soft-edged, hovering. But as they gathered, they took on more detail. Their robes moved like woven starlight. Their eyes glowed, not with fire but with the soft, eternal light of something that had seen the world rise and fall many times. She counted 7 at first. Then 12. Then more. They did not speak. But she heard them. They pulsed with emotion, not in words, but in memory, in scent, in rhythm. One smelled of rain-soaked clay, another of old tobacco and crushed herbs. One brought the taste of wild honey to her tongue. Another made her heart swell with sorrow so thick it brought tears to her eyes. They formed a circle around her, not closing in, but encompassing, a presence like warm breath on cold skin. Amina sank to her knees, overcome, the cloth around her mouth damp with tears. She didn't know why she was crying, only that her body could no longer hold what was pouring into her. Then, from the very center of the circle, stepped a figure she somehow already knew. Her great-grandmother, Mazola. Amina had seen her only once in waking life, an old woman hunched in her bed, eyes foggy, mouth whispering songs no one else remembered. But this version of her was radiant, straight-backed, wrapped in a robe made from patterns Amina had only seen in the most sacred carvings, the cloth of the first women. She glowed from within, the wrinkles of her face replaced with light, but her eyes were unmistakable. They held a kind of knowing Amina had never encountered, not wisdom learned, but wisdom remembered. Mazola reached out her hand, and though she did not speak, Amina heard her clearly. Child of blood and silence, your voice was never stolen. It was tempered. The cloth around Amina's mouth suddenly grew warm, not from fire, but from energy, ancient, resonant. The knot at the back loosened on its own. The ends began to glow, faintly at first, then more brightly, threads of light weaving through the fabric. It did not fall off, but it pulsed, as though waking from a long sleep. They feared your voice because it carried truth. But truth must sometimes go quiet to grow strong. What they called a punishment was our preparation. Amina's hands hovered near her mouth, unsure whether to remove the cloth or let it be. But Mazola gently shook her head. The time is not yet. Your silence is not absence. It is a vessel. You were never meant to be quiet forever, but you were never meant to speak like them, either. The other spirits raised their hands, and Amina was suddenly flooded with images, storms rolling across the horizon, trees split by lightning, fire rushing through dry grass, rivers breaking their banks. She saw the village, her village, gripped by panic. She saw the council of elders arguing beneath the great tree. She saw herself, standing in the sacred grove, wind whipping her hair, eyes alight with something not human. The storm is coming, Mazola said, not with sound, but with the force of truth. Not just of wind and rain, but of revelation. Secrets will be pulled from the soil. Lies will burn. You must stand in it. You must become the stillness in the chaos. Amina's breath caught. Her heart pounded with both fear and understanding. The cloth around her mouth vibrated now, as if in harmony with the spirits. She realized it was not just binding her, it was containing something vast. Her silence had become the cup holding the voice of generations. The spirits around her moved closer now, their light brushing against her skin like memory made flesh. Each one passed a hand over her body, not touching, but blessing, reinforcing. Their energy wove through her like thread through cloth, stitching her into something larger than herself. Amina closed her eyes, feeling herself no longer alone, no longer fractured. When she opened them again, they were gone. All but Mazola. Her great-grandmother stepped forward one last time, placing her glowing hand on Amina's chest. Amina felt a surge of heat, and in that moment, a fragment of voice escaped her lips, not words, but a sound like wind through bone, like a name older than language. Mazola smiled. Your time will come, bridge child. But not yet. Let them think you are silent. Let them believe they hold the stillness. The storm will show them otherwise. Then, like fog under sun, she faded. Amina stood alone in the clearing, the cloth still glowing faintly against her lips, her heart thudding with ancient drums. Her silence no longer felt empty. It was full of voices, of power, of memory. She was not voiceless. She was becoming the voice of something far older. And when she finally spoke again, it would not be just for her. The night after the spirits came, the forest no longer waited. It summoned. Amina felt it as a pull beneath her skin, like a current moving through her blood. The winds that once whispered now pressed gently at her back, guiding her feet forward even as her mind asked no questions. She moved like someone in a trance, not asleep, but more awake than she had ever been. The trees opened before her. Branches once thick and tangled now arched out of the way as if honoring a promise made long before her birth. The forest breathed her in. She walked deeper than she had ever dared, past the root bridges and moss-covered stones, past the ancient bones of fallen giants, trees so old their names had been forgotten. Even the animals seemed to understand her journey. Birds stilled their songs. Insects quieted their buzz. Not a single thing in the forest cried out in alarm. She belonged now, not to the village, not even to herself, but to the space between worlds. The forest was calling her home. Hours passed. Maybe more. Time blurred beneath the canopy, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the underworld. Then she saw it. Through the misted trees rose a structure, crumbling, half swallowed by vines and earth, as if the forest had both protected and punished it. The walls, made of sacred red stone, were etched with markings worn by weather and silence. The roof had collapsed in places, allowing beams of moonlight to spill through like offerings. Amina's breath caught. She knew this place. Not from memory, but from dreams. From the songs her grandmother used to hum before falling asleep. From the old stories once whispered by firelight until they were deemed too dangerous to keep. This was the ancestral temple, the house of the first voice. It had not been seen in generations, and many believed it lost entirely. But it had only been waiting, like her. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her through the shattered archway. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet stone, smoke long gone, and the undeniable hum of presence. Light from the broken ceiling illuminated the center, a raised circle of stone, still marked with faded symbols. Without knowing why, Amina stepped into it and knelt. She did not speak. Could not. But the silence inside her had shifted. It was no longer just absence, it was ceremony. The energy in the air wrapped around her like invisible hands, guiding her into movements she'd never learned but had always known. She placed her palms to the earth. She bowed her head to the stone. She drew spirals in the dust, her fingers trembling, her breath steady. The moment was not planned, and yet it had been waiting for lifetimes. From the darkness above, the spirits returned. They didn't appear as clearly as before. This time, they were fragments of light, energy and motion, drifting down like fireflies. Yet she recognized them. Their presence filled the air, thick with memory and meaning. Amina didn't need their shapes to know who they were. They hummed in her chest, coursed through her fingertips. They were not just watching, they were inside her now, guiding, shaping, remembering. Her hands moved again, tracing patterns on the stone altar. She reached for a nearby bowl, cracked but still whole, and filled it with water from a slow trickle dripping from a wall root. She washed her hands, then splashed water on her face, tilting her head to the sky as the drops ran down her chin. Something stirred deep within her, and she placed her palms over her heart. And then, without warning, the cloth unraveled. No hands touched it. No knife cut it free. It simply released, gently, reverently, falling from her face like a blessing laid down. The air around her pulsed the moment her mouth was exposed, but she did not speak. Her lips remained still, yet her breath seemed louder, her silence somehow magnified. The moment the cloth touched the ground, the wind inside the temple stilled completely. She remained on her knees, quiet, listening. Her silence became a language. The temple responded. The stone beneath her lit up in patterns of soft gold. Lines she had traced began to glow, connecting around her in a web of symbols. Light wrapped around her body, lifting her hair, pressing gently against her skin like unseen fingers playing the strings of an instrument. Her body vibrated, not shaking, but resonating. It was as if every cell inside her remembered something forgotten, as if she were being tuned to a frequency older than time. Then the spirits came closer, their energy forming a column above her. One moved forward, brighter than the rest. Mazola. She didn't walk. She descended. Her light gathered at Amina's forehead, resting there like a kiss. And then Amina felt it, a sudden, searing warmth not of pain, but of power. It pressed into her skin, marking her, branding her not as property but as purpose. The mark was not visible at first. But slowly, as Mazola faded back, a glowing sigil appeared where her hand had rested, a spiral within a flame, surrounded by 3 dots. The mark of awakening. The symbol of the first voice. Amina's eyes fluttered open. Her breath came slower now, deeper. She did not cry. She did not speak. She only stood, taller than she had ever felt, the silence around her so full of meaning that the world itself seemed to lean in and listen. The temple, though broken, felt whole. The air held reverence. The vines around the altar blossomed, faintly, impossibly, their flowers opening in the dark. She had not been abandoned. She had not been cursed. She had been chosen, prepared in silence, shaped by exile, and now reborn by presence. And though her voice was still hidden behind her breath, the world had begun to speak through her. The village of Ndari woke to a silence not born of peace, but of waiting. The birds no longer sang their morning songs. The trees at the edge of the sacred grove stood too still, their leaves barely rustling even as the wind passed overhead. Something had shifted, not just in the forest, but in the bones of the land itself. The elders felt it first. Livestock began refusing to enter the forest fringe. Goats turned abruptly at the tree line, braying with agitation, eyes wide with confusion and fear. The hunters, seasoned men who had once marched into the woods without hesitation, now hesitated at the boundary where route met village. Tools went missing. Traps were found twisted, vines tangled in symbols they could not recognize. The stream that wound its way past the huts turned cloudy overnight, not with mud, but with a deep, swirling darkness that never settled. Children began waking in the middle of the night, crying with stories too vivid to ignore. They spoke of flames dancing through trees, of women with glowing eyes standing at the foot of their beds, of chants and languages no longer spoken by the living. One boy, barely old enough to walk, whispered that the moon had come down and kissed his forehead, and when his mother checked, a faint spiral glowed there for the briefest second before fading. The elders gathered in urgent silence beneath the okan tree, eyes dark, hands restless. They had held this village together for decades, kept the old stories buried, silenced the voices that threatened to split tradition apart. But now the old stories were clawing their way back to the surface. The signs were not subtle. The seal was breaking. "It is the girl," one elder hissed, his voice trembling not with anger, but fear. "Her silence has drawn them out." "She should never have been left alone," another muttered. "We warned the forest once. We must warn it again." But deep down, they all knew. The warning had not been heard because it had not been heeded. And the cloth they had bound around her mouth had not contained her. It had summoned something larger than them all. That night, the council decided. Amina must be cast out fully, not just from the village, but from memory. Her name would be erased from the family stones. Her hut burned. Her footsteps untraced. If she returned, they would call upon the warriors to ensure she never returned again. But not everyone agreed. Word of the signs had spread beyond the elders. Among the villagers were still those who remembered the old ways, the root songs, the forest rites, the breath chants once passed down before fear replaced reverence. Quietly, under moonlight, a group of them, 7 in total, led by an elder widow named Doma, slipped away from the village and made their way into the forest. They carried no torches. Fire would not be welcomed. Instead, they followed the strange wind, the rhythm beneath their feet, and the scent of crushed leaves that seemed to whisper which direction to go. The deeper they moved, the more alive the forest became. Trees leaned back to make way. Vines curled out of their path. The air was thick, charged, and heavy, as if the forest itself were breathing in anticipation. Then they saw her. In a clearing none of them recognized, one that did not exist on any known trail, Amina stood at the center of a glowing ring of spirits. The figures hovered above the earth, their robes shifting like smoke, their eyes burning with light older than the stars. They made no sound, and yet the forest pulsed with energy. Above, the sky churned, clouds spun in tight spirals, and the wind howled like a song without words. Leaves swirled violently around the clearing, caught in an invisible current. Amina was no longer just the silenced girl from the edge of the village. She stood tall, wrapped in a simple cloth, her face calm, her eyes brilliant with something that no human had ever worn. Her feet were bare, rooted to the earth like they had always belonged there. Around her, the spirits hummed in unity, not protection, not threat, but declaration. The cloth that had once bound her mouth now hung from her wrist like a banner, faintly glowing. The sigil on her forehead pulsed, casting a warm, rhythmic light that seemed to echo with every beat of the forest. The villagers gasped, frozen. One woman dropped to her knees first. Then another. And another. Until all 7 were kneeling in the undergrowth, heads bowed, arms trembling. They didn't speak. They couldn't. What they were witnessing was not meant for words. It was meant for knowing. Amina stepped forward slowly. The spirits parted slightly to let her pass. She did not touch the villagers. She didn't need to. Her silence surrounded them, filled their lungs like incense, reached into the hollow spaces between what they believed and what they remembered. She closed her eyes, and the air snapped, not with violence, but clarity. The mark on her forehead flared. And the villagers heard it, not sound, but truth. They saw visions not their own, of fire cleansing the past, of spirits rising from the earth, of a voice that could heal the land without speaking a single word. Amina was the one the songs had whispered of. The one who would awaken the roots and summon the sky. The one who had been silenced so that the ancestors could speak through her. The wind stilled. The leaves dropped gently to the ground. And Amina turned her gaze back toward the village. The storm had not yet come. But its path was clear. The morning of the reckoning came with no sunrise. Dark clouds gathered over Ndari before first light, curling like smoke across the sky, cloaking the village in premature dusk. Birds did not sing. Dogs did not bark. The air was still, as if the very breath of the world had been paused. The elders stood beneath the okan tree, armed not with weapons, but with words, sharp-edged declarations and old rituals meant to seal away what they feared. Their decision had been made: Amina was to be banished, or if she resisted, eliminated. She carries a storm inside her, Elder Muniru had said. If we do not strike, it will strike us first. But it was too late for containment. The wind began to rise as they formed a procession, old chants muttered beneath their breath, their hands smeared with ash. Warriors stood to the side, spears in hand, eyes uncertain. They had been told they were preserving order, protecting the village from ruin. Yet none of them could shake the image of Amina in the clearing, surrounded by spirits, her silence thicker than fear, her presence blooming like a second sun. When she appeared at the edge of the sacred grove, the air cracked like dry wood. She walked alone, barefoot, dressed in a single wrap of earth-tone cloth. Her hair moved in the wind that had begun to circle her body, spiraling upward. Around her, the trees stirred, leaves shivering as if whispering secrets. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one pressing the weight of centuries into the soil beneath. The cloth that once silenced her still hung from her wrist, though now it shimmered faintly, pulsing with a deep, golden light. The elders formed a line at the boundary between forest and village, chanting, calling on protective names, ancestors they had ignored for generations. They raised their staffs, marked with old symbols, invoking banishment, invoking fear. Amina stopped just before them, a few paces from the line they had drawn in the earth. She did not raise her hands. She made no gesture. She only stood, watching them with eyes that no longer belonged entirely to the living. She must leave now. Elder Minairo barked, voice quivering beneath forced authority. She brings unrest, she. His words cut off as the wind suddenly roared, a great rush of force that blasted outward from behind Amina, sweeping through the line of elders and scattering their robes and staffs like twigs. The trees at the grove's edge bent forward sharply, their branches stretching protectively toward her. The sky above cracked with light, not lightning, but something older, a radiant fissure that glowed from within the clouds. Then the spirits came. No longer fragments, no longer flickers. They descended visibly, bodies of light and mist and shadow, wrapped in the ceremonial robes of ancient lineages. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They stood beside Amina, behind her, in a formation that rippled with memory. Their eyes shone with sorrow, not vengeance, their silence heavier than stone. The villagers poured from their homes, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Children clung to their mothers. The warriors lowered their weapons. All knew, this was not a moment of defiance. It was a return. A reckoning. Amina took one step forward. The cloth around her wrist began to glow brighter, and then, slowly, it lifted into the air, held up by unseen hands. In a sudden burst of light, it ignited, burning in a flame that made no smoke, only silence. It did not fall to ash. It disappeared. Now, nothing remained between her and the world. She opened her mouth. And said nothing. Yet the air changed. The earth trembled. From the center of her chest, a burst of energy erupted, not light, not sound, but something beyond either. A wave of ancestral force surged outward, rippling through the elders, the warriors, the villagers, the children. It moved like a pulse of soul through the land. All at once, they dropped. Not from harm, from revelation. The moment the wave touched them, their minds filled with visions, not of Amina's story, but their own. The truth of what had been hidden. They saw the secrets buried beneath the altar stones. The girl who vanished years ago, not taken by spirits, but silenced by men. The son of a warrior, bruised in secret, now grown and afraid to remember. The screams they ignored. The wisdom they had called madness. The prayers they rewrote to suit power. The elders who hoarded the sacred herbs, denying women their birthright. The dreams that had come to children, buried, mocked, and stolen. One by one, every soul in the village witnessed their own complicity. Some wept immediately, collapsing into sobs. Others fell to their knees and held their faces in shaking hands. A few screamed, not out of pain, but from the shattering of everything they believed was holy. The sound was not loud. It was soft, devastated. Elder Muniru staggered back, his mouth open, eyes wide with recognition. Tears streamed down his face. He dropped his staff. Amina stood unmoved, her eyes closed, the energy fading slowly from her body. Her skin glowed faintly. The mark on her forehead pulsed with a steady rhythm. The spirits behind her stood tall, watching. Some reached out their hands, resting them on the shoulders of villagers, elders, warriors. Comfort. Witness. The village, once so loud with rules and noise, fell into a collective hush. Children sobbed against their mothers. Young men sat with heads bowed. Even the animals seemed subdued, curled quietly near the huts, tails still, eyes shining. And in the center of it all, Amina, silent, radiant, unbroken. She had not spoken a single word. But the truth had spoken through her. And for the first time in living memory, the entire village listened. The rains returned, not as punishment, but as grace. They came gently at first, a soft drizzle that coated the leaves in silver and made the soil breathe again. Then, over the weeks that followed the reckoning, the skies wept openly, steadily, blessing the dry earth with every drop. The villagers of Ndari watched in reverent silence as the land stirred to life. What had once been brittle turned supple. Fields that had cracked from drought now cradled green shoots. The air smelled of rebirth, of wet bark, turned soil, and the faint sweetness of blossoms the elders thought extinct. No one spoke of the reckoning directly. There were no ceremonies, no formal apologies, no public admissions of guilt. But everything changed. The village moved differently now, with caution, with humility, with listening in their bones. The okan tree, once a symbol of judgment and decree, stood quietly at the center of the village, its roots somehow fuller, its leaves brighter. People began to leave offerings at its base, carved figures, woven strands of grass, tiny bowls of honey. Not because they were told to. Because they needed to. And high above, hidden in the sacred folds of the forest, Amina made her home among the ruins of the ancestral temple. The stones had shifted slightly since the night the spirits descended. Moss grew along the broken walls, but now it glowed faintly at dusk. Vines no longer strangled the structure, they draped it gently, as if protecting it. The altar at the center was always clean, though no one could say who tended it. Birds perched on its edges and sang in long, winding melodies that mimicked the rhythms of lost chants. The air around the temple buzzed, not with insects, but with presence. Amina lived there, not as an exile, but as something more ancient than a priestess. She did not preach. She did not command. She simply was, sitting beneath the cracked roof with her hands folded, her silence deep and still and alive. And people came. Not in hordes, and never in desperation, but in small, meaningful pairs and trios. A mother with a child who spoke to trees. A young man whose dreams kept showing him the same spiral symbol. An old woman who had forgotten her name in grief and wanted to remember it again. They came with burdens, not expecting cures but hoping to be seen. Amina would offer them no words. Instead, she would place a hand gently over their chest or forehead. Sometimes she would walk with them to a specific tree. Sometimes she would trace a shape in the dirt with her fingertip and leave it behind, glowing faintly as they walked away. And always, they left lighter. Children were the first to truly understand. They would climb the forest path without fear, their feet steady, their hands full of flowers or stones to offer. Around the temple, they played games that mimicked what they saw, taking turns pretending to be Amina, sitting in circles with cloths tied gently around their mouths, tracing spirals in the earth. When asked what they were doing, they replied with simple clarity, "We're listening for the old ones." To them, silence was no longer punishment. It was a secret language. A superpower. The cloth, once a symbol of shame, transformed under their hands. Parents wove strips of it into protective amulets. Young girls tied it around their heads when they wanted to feel brave. Some boys carried pieces folded in their pockets when they went to the forest. It was no longer about muting, it was about remembering. About becoming quiet enough to hear the things that truly mattered. Back in the village, the council of elders gathered for the last time. They met not to pass judgment, but to pass on. One by one, the surviving elders stepped down from their seats beneath the okan tree, laying their staffs at its roots. No speeches. No drama. Just quiet resignation. They had come to see their power for what it was, a brittle imitation of wisdom. And they were tired of holding back the tide. Elder Muniru, once the fiercest voice against Amina, wept openly as he placed his hands against the bark of the tree and whispered, "Forgive me." It was the last thing he ever said in public. In the vacuum of old power, something unexpected grew. The villagers began meeting in circles, not pyramids. The spirit keeper's lineage was reawakened, not in titles, but in service. Songs returned, not sung from memory, but rising spontaneously in fields and courtyards, carried by wind and children and fire. People prayed less with words and more with actions. Food was shared more freely. Sorrow was witnessed, not buried. Healing, like the rain, came steadily. Amina's presence rippled outward, like a stone dropped into a still lake. News of her spread, not as gossip, but as a kind of myth, real enough to reach ears, sacred enough not to be questioned. Neighboring villages sent quiet visitors. A woman from the hills came after dreaming of a glowing sigil for 6 nights. A father from the valley brought his son, who had begun waking in the middle of the night humming a melody that no one alive knew. Each found their way to the temple, left something behind, a fear, a regret, a question, and returned lighter. Amina never left the forest again. She didn't need to. Her silence traveled farther than any messenger, her stillness echoed deeper than any drum. The forest that had once been feared now became a sanctuary. People came not to seek miracles, but to remember who they had been before fear taught them to forget. And Amina remained at the center of it all, not a ruler, not a saint, but a still flame at the heart of something reborn. No longer the girl they tried to silence. Now the voice through which the ancestors breathed. The fire crackled low, throwing sparks into the dusk like stars returning to the sky. Around the flickering light, children and elders gathered, wrapped in woven blankets, their faces warm with smoke and memory. The storyteller, a woman with silvered braids and eyes that had seen both famine and rain, leaned forward. Her voice was soft, but carried easily, as if the forest itself leaned closer to listen. "You ask why we tie the cloth around our mouths during rites," she began, her fingers gently smoothing the strip of indigo-dyed fabric folded in her lap. "Why the girls wear it when they walk into womanhood, why the boys bow before the trees. Let me tell you a story, the story of the woman who never spoke again, because she didn't need to." The children grew still. Her voice wrapped around the night like a lullaby. She was called Amina. Born in the old days, when truth was feared and silence was punishment. They bound her mouth because she dared to speak what others would not. They called it protection, tradition, obedience. But what they feared was her knowing. What they feared was her becoming. She paused to toss a handful of dried leaves into the fire. They hissed and flared, filling the air with the scent of eucalyptus and clove. They said she disappeared into the forest. And in a way, she did. But the forest did not devour her. It remembered her. Carried her. Crowned her. The children's eyes widened. They had heard pieces of this story before, in fragments, in riddles, in dreams. But never like this. She never spoke another word after the day the cloth burned away. But do not think that means she was silent. Her silence echoed louder than thunder. It cracked open lies. It healed wounds. It called the ancestors home. She turned toward the youngest girl, who clutched a carved wooden doll in her lap. "Do you know the temple in the forest?" The girl nodded, wide-eyed. "Have you seen the wall behind the altar?" Another nod. "Then you have seen her. Etched in stone, standing in a circle of light, the spirits all around her. That image wasn't carved by hands. They say the stone shaped itself." Around the fire, the others listened in reverence. This was no bedtime story. This was blood memory, woven into every breath they took. Because of her, no girl in this village is silenced anymore. They are taught that truth is not dangerous, only those who fear it are. And the boys? They are raised to listen. Not just with ears, but with their hearts. To the wind. To the trees. To the spaces between words. A night bird called from deep in the forest. The flames flickered lower. They come now, from faraway villages, to walk the path she once took. They leave offerings at the temple steps. They kneel where she stood. Some say they feel her there still, not watching, but listening. The storyteller leaned back, her voice becoming a whisper carried by the fire. She never raised her voice again. But she never needed to. The world rose to meet her silence. And in that moment, as the fire crackled and the wind rustled through the trees beyond, a faint hush swept through the gathering, as though something ancient had passed overhead. Something unseen, yet deeply known. The flames trembled once more. Somewhere, in the darkness of the sacred grove, the leaves stirred gently, and the spirits circled still.